summer, it's summer, ha 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 ha. It's summer, ha 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 ha.
Hi guys, and welcome to Piano and Keyboard Artists, where we discuss the artists related to pianos, keyboards and synthesizers. And finally, it's the long-awaited Depeche Mode Black Celebration album review, part 1. Black Celebration was released on the 17th of March 1986, and it was recorded between November and January, the following year, in West Side and Genetic Studios in London, and also Hansa in Germany. Released under the Mute label, Daniel Miller once again was involved, and for the third time we get producer Gareth Jones, and this, as I say, completes the sort of the Gareth Jones trilogy. I think Gareth Jones did phenomenal work as a producer for Depeche Mode, and I'm sure all you Mode fans will agree. So before we delve deeply into Black Celebration, let's go back to the end of Some Great Reward, when they released one of their best songs ever, in my opinion, Shake the Disease. I'm sure many Mode fans will agree that Shake the Disease is a brilliant song. So Shake the Disease came about. The timing with Shake the Disease was a bit bad because obviously it was in a period between two albums, so as a result it never ended up on an album. I suppose if you listen to Shake the Disease now, you probably can't imagine it fitting on Some Great Reward or Black Celebration. I suppose as far as production goes, they could have fitted it onto either album, but I think Shake the Disease kind of stands out as its own sort of like an interim single. And round about that time, they released this 1981 to 85 compilation album. And there was a bit of apprehension about the release of that album. It was really like a greatest hits up until that point. Now, the reason they were a little bit apprehensive about releasing it was because the Depeche Mode and Daniel, were sort of conscious of the fact of, what signal are we putting out? Are we sort of putting out a signal that, this is the end of the band and here's our greatest hits? Because we see that often with bands, when they release a definitive or a greatest hits album, the writing's usually on the wall that this is the end of the band. But of course, that was one way to look at it. But the way they chose to view it, which was a more positive way, was to say, okay, this is a celebration of the period from 81 to 85. So this singles collection, 81 to 85, was more like the story so far collection. And I looking back at it, I mean, listening to it, it's a great sort of it's a great sort of showcase of from Mode, from its early inception up until the point of the end of Some Great Reward. So with the release of this 81 to 85 compilation album, it was decided obviously to put two new tracks to add to it, to kind of promote it. And that's where Shake the Disease and It's Called a Heart came in. Now, It's Called a Heart gets a lot of rap from, Martin Gore said it's probably his least favorite song ever. And I know a lot of fans don't like it. Personally, I don't feel the song is as bad as what people say it is. I mean, I can be a lot more critical of their last two albums if I have to jump ship a little bit. But I think It's Called a Heart, yeah, I suppose in retrospect, it wasn't a great song. However, it's not a bad song. I suppose the lyrics are a bit naff, I suppose. But, the actual production, the sort of metallic sound and the atmosphere to it and everything, I don't think it's that bad. Of course, the B-side to It's Called a Heart was Fly on the Windscreen. And Alan Wilder fought tooth and nail to get that flipped. He really wanted Fly on the Windscreen to kind of be the single as opposed to It's Called a Heart. But of course, Alan and the band never got their way because they said, the first word on the song Fly on the Windscreen is death. Death is everywhere. And that was not really a good thing to do, I suppose. So It's Called a Heart, because as my art teacher, Mrs. Byrne, used to say, God bless her, rest her soul, Vaughan, if you want to be in with a man in the street, you need to lower your standards. And, of course, no disrespect to the man in the streets, but I think Depeche Mode had to kind of go, and this is quite obvious throughout the history of Depeche Mode, and even when we get to, we'll talk later about But Not Tonight, which the American market kind of released as the single, which Depeche Mode were not happy about as well. There seems to be this pattern through Depeche Mode's career where they were in this difficult position of trying to do what they wanted to do, but at the same time to try and win audience over. And that's always a very, very fine line to walk. Is it's kind of like you don't want to sell out, but you don't want to be doing it so that no one buys your records. You want to have some kind of commercial appeal whilst retaining some artistic credibility as an artist, and that's very difficult as an artist. Of course, I think when we get to this period of the 81 to 85, Depeche Mode had really sort of, I think it was a good thing for them to do that album, because that kind of like, it's almost like as I say, it kind of wraps up that period. And then we can, start off new with the Black Celebration, which we're going to jump into now very deeply. Now, I said this is going to be a 4-part series. Because I want to go into a lot of detail, it might be a 5-part series. I'm not sure yet, but I do wish to cover this in as much detail as I possibly can. Right, so let's look at Black Celebration. So this is one of my favorite Depeche Mode albums. And this really, in the words of Martin Gore, was the point where Martin said in an interview that after Black Celebration, every album after that had like a thread running through it for him. Because this was kind of like where Martin really found, okay, this is exactly where we need to be. And as I said, all the pieces came together on the previous album really. And this is where they decided to up the ante. Now, if you look at their history, starting off as the 4 Young Pretty Boys, weren't being taken seriously. I think most people thought they would be one-hit wonders. Of course, by the time they got to Construction Time Again, people were starting to take them seriously. By the time Some Great Reward came out, they were really, really being taken very, very seriously. And now, because of all that, there's all this added pressure. And with that added pressure, they decided, opus magnum time. We need to up the ante once again and release this. And I'm happy to say they got it right, because if you look at from where they started, they just got better and better. And this tension and this desire to do things, better than better and to raise the bar is very, very well illustrated in the next episode, which comes out on Sunday. And that's the interview with Brian Griffin. Now, as you know, I've been doing an interview with Brian regarding all the album artwork, because he did everything from Speak and Spell up to Black Celebration. And I was always curious to know why it all stopped at this period. Because Brian Griffin's artwork has been, iconic and award-winning. And I was always wondered why they decided to get rid of Brian after this. Now, I don't believe it was anything sinister. I know with Depeche Mode, just as they stopped using Gareth Jones in this album, I don't think it was anything sinister. Or maybe Gareth had enough, but I don't think it was anything sinister. Depeche Mode are like that. They like to change the way they do things. They like to change producers. Having said that, they've been using Anton Corbijn for many years, ever since they stopped using Brian. But what I'm trying to point out is in that interview that I've got with Brian Griffin about the Black Celebration artwork, Brian will speak very openly and honestly, in a way that no one's heard him speak before, regarding this period. And there was a bit of friction within the workings of the whole operation. Of course, I don't want to cast aspersions onto any individual member, but let's just say things were getting so serious to the point that I think it was almost not fun in a way, because and understandably, Depeche Mode were massive. They were a massive international act at this stage. They were not only controversial because of their sound, but they were also very marketable. They were very unusual because they were selling a lot of records for a band that didn't have a very commercial sound. So they had a lot going for them. And this really was the period where things did become darker in more ways than one. it's well documented that Black Celebration started off quite negatively, so far as in typical Depeche Mode style. Before they start an album, they will have a pre-production period, and before that, it usually involves Martin bringing the demos in to play to the band and to Daniel. And that was greeted with a lot of, I won't say resentment from Daniel, but Daniel did really just say something along the lines of, look, there are no hits on this. It's too moody. It's too downbeat. It's too dark. It'll never get played on the radio. Of course, Martin took offense to that, and I think Martin said he stormed off and like disappeared for a week. And as if you're an artist, you'll notice like you know your songs and your art are like your baby, and you know when people criticize them, it's like don't criticize my art. And I think the reason maybe Martin felt offended, and of course this is just my own opinion, is because they trusted Daniel. Daniel was very, very instrumental in their success. So I think when Daniel turns around, you know, and he'd helped them make so many good decisions up till this point. So when Daniel says, I'm not sure about this, I think it probably hurt Martin a bit. Daniel goes on to say that I believe the demos that Martin presented were actually even darker than the record we got here. So yeah, I haven't heard all the demos, I've heard some of them. But I love Martin's demos. They really, I want to do a separate series in which I'm calling From Demo to Completion, where we will take Martin's demos and talk about how they transpired into the final products. But anyway, that's a separate series I want to bring to my already manic schedule. So with Martin presenting a really odd, downbeat, dark batch of songs, it was understandable that Daniel would have thought, oh, I don't know, because if you listen to Some Great Reward, it had songs like Master and Servant, which were quite upbeat, and Master and Servant's production really was them trying to emulate the Frankie Goes to Hollywood relaxed kind of sound, that big Trevor Horn sound. Separate subject. So I find with commercial music, it always has to have this kind of upbeat, dancey element to it. I don't know why that is, and that still seems apparent these days. But something like Black Celebration, as I say, this is really a concept album. This to me is a concept album. But this is where Gore and Depeche Mode are brilliant, is when Depeche Mode to me were always not in the music industry. They were like off on their own trip. And that's where they belong, you know. When there's any sort of leanings towards trying to make something commercial or trying to make things more appealing, I think that's where they fell hopelessly. And that's only because, the mainstream can't really relate to this. But I mean, what do the mainstream know? The songs were odd, but in retrospect and in hindsight, and also as we will discuss with Brian Griffin, there were a lot of problems behind the making of this album cover. But in retrospect, despite the problems, I hold in my hands here one of the best pieces of electronic pop ever produced. In order to get the best out of this production and to sort of add real gravitas and, just to sort of live the album, they decided to live the album. They decided that throughout the production of this record, they would come into the studio every single day from the time it was started right until the last day that they finished the final mix. And that resulted in pretty much a 4-month period of coming in every single day for up to 14 hours. Now you can imagine that, just the claustrophobic nature of just getting 4 people in a room, and the disagreements that you would have as a band, and the squabbles and everything. And I'm sure, as they said, it got really tense sometimes, but that is what I believe imprinted itself onto the soul of this record, was all that claustrophobic, that broodiness. Alan Wilder talks about a broodiness that came from Daniel Miller. And I think all of those emotional aspects and elements of people's psyche, and their wants and their needs, their fears, and and everything in life and everything. I imagine this really claustrophobic way of working and just seeing the same people every day and just listening to, when you're producing music, listening to the same parts over and over. I think that must have driven them insane to a way. And Fletch did say in an interview that's probably why this was the last album Gareth Jones did, because I believe it was really, really intense. But once again, and I always say this, it's all about the end result. If you listen to the beginning of Black Celebration, just the way it starts, and Black Celebration, the title track, has this really claustrophobic, it doesn't have many cymbals and it doesn't have any sort of like bright, like kind of shimmery sounds to it. And now, having said that, we're going to run through the songs individually in a lot of detail, but just as a sort of a general overview of this album, it is incredibly claustrophobic, tense, dark, but light and beautiful. And there is something that Depeche Mode, the way they did it, whether it be the timing, Gore's songs, the production, and I've said this before, everything came together, and it's like they were at the right place at the right time. And this is just, you're going to hear me say this a lot, this is a work of art. This is genius. This really is. That brings us on to the sound and the production of Black Celebration. Now, Daniel does talk how he did not want it to sound casual and like easy listening. And Depeche Mode's music is not background music. It's not the kind of stuff you'd have in the background. Very often I've had it playing sort of softly and people would come in and go, what's that? It does get your attention for better or for worse. And I think Daniel perfectly captured in that is that he wanted this to be quite, I suppose, whether you like it or not, it's going to get your attention. And it bloody well did, because if you take songs, and as I say, we're going to go through them individually, but I mean, songs like Stripped, which is one of my favorite Depeche Mode songs, it's just so bloody unusual, but it's so beautiful. And every song here is a video on its own, with so many layers that we can delve into. Now, sampling was once again heavily utilized in this album. If we go back to sort of Construction Time again and Some Great Reward, sampling in those days was kind of in its infancy, although there were sort of very underground and experimental acts that were doing it. And Depeche Mode were one of the forerunners, as I said, who kind of took that experimental underground sound and kind of broke it into the mainstream with their presentation and songs. It wasn't too avant-garde. It had a sort of like, it had something that you can that could appeal to the mainstream. It wasn't completely arty-farty. But by the time we get to the production of this album, sampling had kind of been around for a while and well established. So the emphasis was once again to, as with all the Depeche Mode albums, is to really raise the standards, raise the bar higher, up the ante, and present songs in a way that the pop song has not been presented before. I always say that with Martin Gore's songs as the foundation of Depeche Mode, this naturally gave Depeche Mode that edge, because I feel that had they had Vince Clarke writing songs for them still, no offense Vince, I love you, but it's just that Vince writes in a very traditional type of way, and there's nothing wrong with that. Martin Gore's writing is so, some will just say odd or weird, but Martin Gore's songs as the foundation of Depeche Mode, and then bringing those songs as the foundation, and then applying this desire to create the most unusual, out there ways of producing music. So Martin's songs as the foundation of Depeche Mode's sound, coupled with the idea of Depeche Mode's philosophy of presenting songs in a way that had not been heard before, this is where the genius and all the parts came together. They were once again trying to further push the frontiers of sound, present the pop record in a way it had not been presented yet. Gareth Jones talks about how reverb became very important. In their mind at that time, reverb meant atmosphere, so lots of reverb meaning a lot of atmosphere. And you get that from this album. I mean, if you listen to, we don't compare albums, but if you take an album like Violator, which we're going to jump to later in the series. Violator's, as you hear it, is quite a minimalist sounding record. But as some of my geeky producer friends have pointed out, although it is minimalistic sounding sort of on first listen, as you listen to it more, you will actually find there are lots of layered parts which make up the individual sounds. But Black Celebration has got really more of a sort of like it's more of a sort of like a big wall of industrial sound. It is very like atmospheric, and it does kind of put you into those acoustic spaces, which we talked about in the previous 2 album review series, how Gareth Jones was really passionate about using acoustic spaces in a way that it had not usually been used before. So instead of just adding reverb and chorus and delay onto a sound in post-production, as I explained in the last video series, Gareth would record the sound of the room, to further add a feeling of depth and space to the records. Once again, sticking to their philosophy of no guitars. Remember, guitars were no-no in those days. And of course, they never really used guitars up until the day where Flood told them your preconceived ideas are crap and you should use a guitar because Martin's a great guitar player. Of course, in these days, up until this point, they had never used a guitar before. The only time they'd used it, I believe, was in that song And Then, where they used an acoustic guitar. And you can hear an acoustic guitar strum in the beginning of Stripped. Just got that chord. And of course, there's that in Stripped, which has kind of like an electric guitar kind of sound. But yeah, they were very against the guitar because I think in their mind, back in those days, it was kind of like they were still trying to prove that electronic music was a credible and viable way to present music. They were still fighting a lot of criticism and the traditional rock press, meaning if there's no guitars, it's no good. So I think Depeche Mode took it to the extreme. They went, okay, well, just to prove a point, we will not have guitars in it to prove that the world is wrong. And the rest is history, because if you look at the way music is made these days, Depeche Mode were dead right. So right from the start of this album, it just draws you in. Whether you like it or not, and who doesn't like this, it just makes you think. The Depeche Mode is music for, I don't want to say, this sounds very arrogant, but I'm going to say it. Depeche Mode is music for people with brains, I always say this, and I've had arguments with people before when they say it's shit. I say, well, you're just too dumb. But from the moment you get into it, we're here to celebrate the fact that we've seen the back of another black day. I'll drink to that. It's negative and positive at the same time, and it has such a claustrophobic sound. And then when we get onto Fly in the Windscreen, which has got that sense of dread and tension. In fact, it's not till we get to the third song, which is Question of Lust, one of the most beautiful Depeche Mode songs and one of the most beautiful Martin Gore songs of all time. The fragile, like a baby in your arms. It's just like a beautiful lullaby. As I say, we're going to go into the songs in detail. But as a general sound of this record, it is just absolutely stunning. This record combines psychology with sex, drama, lust, inhibition, excess. It is a reflection of the human condition, presented in a very dark, deep, thought-provoking, honest, beautiful way. This is going to be a long series, guys. But I absolutely love this album. Have I not said that yet? Right, guys, and that concludes part 1 of the Black Celebration album review. As I said, I've advertised it as a 4-part series, but we are going to go into a lot more detail. As I say, the next episode will be on Sunday, and that will be the interview with Brian Griffin, and we're going to be talking about these stunning poster prints which he has made exclusively to the Vaughan George channel. As I say, it's a never been seen before black and white version of the album cover, and Brian has made those available to the channel. And as you can see, here's one he's autographed with his rock and roll signature. We're going to talk about that. But in that interview, we're also going to be talking about how Brian felt the tension in and around the band got to a point where he wasn't used anymore. And I believe it was not, as I said, it was not a sinister reason that they didn't use him anymore. I just think Depeche Mode wanted to change things up. And of course, they had found Anton by that point. So, as I say, all will be revealed in that video. The next part after that will be delving into the songs individually. I also want to talk about the B-sides. I want to talk about the vocals. And I want to strip down some of the sounds. Strip, pardon the pun. Guys, I do apologize that it's taken me so long to get to this because I know I put the little teaser out several weeks ago. I like to be prepared, but I don't like to be too rehearsed because, as you say, I like to talk to you like we're just sitting in a room. And you can probably tell by the way I speak, I'm really passionate about this and I'd like to keep it that way. Guys, if this is the first time to my channel, I would like to welcome you with open arms and I'm hoping you will hit that subscribe button, click the like and share this with your friends or anyone you feel would be interested in this content. Please join the Vaughan George Facebook group. I will leave links to that below. We're having such a great time with networking and hanging out with you guys in there. And leave your comments below. Let me know what you think about Black Celebration. Anything you want me to elaborate on deeper. And I look forward to seeing you guys on the next video. Be great, be good, take care.